Hello, everybody. I am Michael Kimmage, the director of the Kennan Institute, and am delighted today to welcome two very distinguished guests to have a conversation about the state of Ukrainian studies, which we're going to talk about historically, but also with an eye to the future. And joining us today are Professor Oxana Shevel, Professor of Political Science and Director of the International Relations Program at Tufts University. And in the case of both of our guests, I could, have very, very long lists of publications. I'm just going to isolate one because it seems highly relevant, of course, to our conversation. And this is Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Divergent States, which Professor Shevel published with Polity Books in 2024. We're joined as well by Serhii Plokhy, who's Mikhailo Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard University. And I will isolate, in his case, a single book as well, The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine, which was published by Basic Books in 2015, and I think has subsequent editions after that. Great thanks to both of you for joining us today, and welcome to the long view. I'll start there.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
And I'd like to begin, I think we'll kind of go back and forth for 45, 50 minutes, and then the audience is most welcome to submit questions to the Q&A function. Would like to begin with Oxana, and I'll pose the same question to Serhii in a moment. And to begin at the beginning, which is to say the story of Ukrainian studies in North America. I'm not going to ask just about the United States because both Canada and the United States play, I think, an important role in this story, but about the origins of Ukrainian studies in North America and, sort of when it began, and a few thoughts about the beginning phases of this discipline in the Anglosphere and in North America.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure Serhii will have more insight being a historian. Me not being a historian, I can sort of give just very general overview. It's important to realize that I think because Ukraine has not been a state, right? The Ukrainian state did not exist. And oftentimes when we think of, studies in abroad of some country, right? It's often the government of this country that would be providing support, like funding. Sometimes governments allocate specific, amounts of institutions, money, and so forth. And that has not, of course, been the case with Ukrainian studies because there hasn't been a Ukrainian state. The short-lived republic in the early 20th century accepted, but that was not in a position to support Ukrainian studies. So it was really, we can think of it as sort of grassroots initiatives, and it has been people who, starting in the early 20th century, who have been of Ukrainian descent, right, who started many of these initiatives and was kind of originally in a way peripheral, maybe academic interest, and then it developed in a very robust field, especially during the Cold War with the involvement of diaspora and, of course, the initiatives such as the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute that was founded, I believe in 1973, was funded Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies in 1976, right? And the main influence at the time, one of the key influences was preserving the culture, but then, of course, there was also in language, but then there was also integration with the Cold War studies that, again, kind of the focus was more on sort of Sovietology and how Ukraine was sort of subsumed in a way in that field. So the distinctive part was, my understanding, and Serhii, please correct me if that's not how you would characterize it, was more sort of focus on language, history, culture, less on politics, society, again, because Ukraine was not a state, was under Soviet rule, and that would only begin to change after the end of the Soviet Union.
Yes, I certainly agree with Oksana, and the Ukrainian studies here in the US and North America were born like Russian studies or studies in Eastern Europe after 1917, after the revolution, and the emigres, including academic emigres, coming to the United States. The first history in English of Ukraine was published in 1940. So the interest was there before, because World War II just started. And that history was by Mikhailo Hrushevsky, published with the help of George Vernadsky at Yale University in 1940. And Vernadsky himself, it's interesting just to characterize the state of the studies of Ukraine and the region, came to Yale because he was invited by another emigre scholar, Rostovtsev, who studied Byzantine. And Russia was not a subject, not a legitimate subject. Byzantine was in the 1920s. So he had to convince his colleagues that a legitimate studies invited Vernadsky. And then Vernadsky, to a degree, was helpful in bringing also some sort of legitimacy to Ukrainian studies. But as Oksana said, the real story of Ukrainian studies here in North America starts after World War II. Again, emigre scholars were very important, but even more important were students, because back in the 1950s, the Ukrainian students decided that, well, it's not normal when the only subjects that being taught are Russian history or Russian literature. And they created a special organization that became later known as Ukrainian Studies Fund, collecting money to establish chairs in Ukrainian studies, which at that time meant really humanities. So it would be language, it would be literature, it would be history, and that was the core of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. The Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies that was established a little bit later, but still in the 70s, they're celebrating now 50-year anniversary, had a different direction, more social sciences. People like Bogdan Kravchenko, sociologist who was there. So the direction was a little bit different. So one institute really complemented another. So that was the beginning, and 1991 changed that. But I think we'll talk about that a little bit later.
I want to still linger in the period before 1991, and I'll start now with you, Serhii, and then turn to Oksana. And I don't want to assume too much in asking this question, but it's the one that comes to mind for me, and this is the distorting effect of the Cold War period, or perhaps the distorting effect of the Cold War period on Ukrainian studies. Because on the one hand, there's a massive investment that comes from the U.S. government in the study of the region after 1945. On the other, it feels to me like the Cold War American University and perhaps Cold War Canadian University focuses very much on Moscow, that it's a concern about geopolitics, it's a concern about arms control, it's a concern about the fate of the Kremlin, Kremlinology, et cetera. And that seems to me, a focus that has its limitations. And I wanted to ask about that, the kind of potentially distorting effects of the Cold War mindset and the Cold War framework for the emergence of Ukrainian studies.
Yes, thank you for this question. I remember encountering people at Harvard who were attributing the creation of the Ukrainian Research Institute to the Cold War, situation, atmosphere in general, when in reality that was something that was done outside and maybe contrary to the Cold War trends, because the founders of the institute, Professor Pritsak, Professor Shevchenko, were experts in medieval or early modern studies, so as far away as one can imagine from the concerns of the immediate concerns, at least of the Cold War. And yes, it's the Cold War really, in general, privileged the focus on Moscow, on the center. That meant also Russia as well. And I just met only one scholar of Ukraine who really made it in the hierarchy of the Cold War scholars. That was Professor Bogdan Butsurkiv. And he was a preeminent expert on religion in the Soviet Union, so wrote a defining article on Lenin and religion and so on and so forth. So even there, the entrance was through the door of humanities and culture and religion. One example of how the Cold War really privileged approach to the history, focus on criminology and the center, is the story of the origins of the Association for Study of Nationalities, which is now the primary really forum for meeting of scholars working on the region. It was founded by a combination of emigres who were studying marginal topics by the definition of the 60s and 70s. So some of them, Michael Rifkin was one of them, and then there were a couple of Ukrainian and Polish scholars, and they created that organization and association really on the margins of Sovietology. And once 91 happened, suddenly that became the main academic forum. So that's for me the story of that organization is the most interesting example of how the field changed.
Oksana, if I could turn to you with the same question about the Cold War paradigm.
Yes, Serhii covered it very well. I'll just add sort of a little bit more on the political science angle of things. Being a political scientist, it's really interesting because when we study any country, right? Like, of course, you want to know what the central government does, but that's by no means kind of the only focus of the field, right? Like, you would be studying various social processes, for example, divisions within the government, right? Like various institutional arrangements. Like, if it's a big country like the Soviet Union was, like how things were different in different regions and why. And none of this, or at least certainly not in any kind of depth, was the focus during the Cold War. You mentioned yourself, Michael, this kind of focus on Kremlinology and what was happening, in Moscow. And I think people even studied like how, in what order people stood at the mausoleum during the parades, right, of the 7th of November, and kind of try to deduce what was happening politically from these sorts of things. And I would say that on the one hand, it's almost like inevitable, right? Because if you have a closed society where access is limited, where clearly central leadership had a lot of power, like, that there is focus on that, it's understandable. But of course, as we know, subsequently, once Soviet Union, Gorbachev started his reforms, what was happening in the different republics, politically speaking, right, including in Ukraine, was very important. And even like this informal split in the Ukrainian Communist Party between so-called national communists who would then throw their lot with independence movement. Maria Popova and I talk about it in our book as a really key defining moment. Serhii had written about it. Like, that just was not studied, right? So again, this focus on the Kremlinology and kind of on Moscow on the one hand, when politics was concerned, right? And then sort of in the what we now call area studies, in regional studies, the focus more on kind of cultural aspects, right, on language and history, which of course are all important. But that, in a way, I would say, was sort of another blind spot of the Cold War, was overly focused, but when it came to study politics in particular, on Moscow, to the exclusion not just Ukraine, but other republics in the Soviet Union, and political processes that were, of course, controlled by the party in various ways, suppressed, but still happening, and that would turn out to be very, very consequential later, from late 1980s on. So that, in a way, I think, was another legacy of the Cold War.
If I think of the policy community in the United States, I think one of the reasons that it had such a hard time seeing an end to the Soviet Union, which is more or less the case of every policy expert in the late 1980s, one of the reasons I think is they didn't pay enough attention to the Soviet world outside of Moscow. So, there are academic implications to focusing on the center, as you call it, Serhii, but there are also policy implications which are interesting to consider in retrospect. Oksana, I would like to stay with you in asking about the next question, which I think is the inevitable next question. And so, Ukraine achieves its independence in 1991. It's one of the prime movers in the breakup of the Soviet Union, and that can't help, I would assume, but have revolutionary consequences for the study of Ukraine. You had mentioned earlier, Oksana, that in the Cold War period, Ukraine is not an independent nation state, and that has an effect on how the region is studied. So the arrival of Ukraine as an independent nation state in 1991 had to be transformative, and I'm curious about your thoughts about the sort of academic opportunities and questions that open up after 1991.
Yeah, again, this is, like in both Serhii and I come to North America at around the same time. So it is sort of very, interesting, also kind of point of comparison. I would just, by way of an anecdote, mention that when I first came to the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, I think it was like 93, I was visiting at the time. The first person I met waiting in the reception area to, meet people who works at the Ukrainian Research Institute was the person who admitted me to Komsomol in the Soviet high school just a few years ago. And I was like, what are you doing here? And he had the same thought, like, what are we doing here? Right. But I think the sort of that, that aside, the transformation, I mean, obviously, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a huge event. And I think in many sense, the study of this, because so many experts, did not predict it. Of course, there was no shortage of explanations once this happened, but that was like seismic event, right? In a way, I think the studies had to catch up with the realities, right? So that's also not something that doesn't maybe very often happens in the academic studies when the field is transformed fundamentally by something that happens outside the field, right? And happens very unexpectedly and very rapidly. And I think again, one of the changes then it becomes much greater attention to social science, sort of to politics, to economics, to societal dimensions. Of course, in Ukraine there were protests, so the revolution, what was known revolution on the granite, massive protests for independence. And that is also something that was kind of caught people off guard. Of course, for example, civil society has been studied in political science and sociology and so forth. But in the Soviet Union, important lens during the Cold War, the society was passive, right? That it was suppressed by the Soviet state. And here it is, we have this explosion of activity. So how do you study this? So I think what I'm trying to say, that certain theoretical themes, scholarly kind of, intellectual, themes, analytical themes, that were not maybe part of the study of Ukraine before that become part of the study of Ukraine, So for example, protests and civil society is, one of it, like party politics becomes one of it. And as far as the study in North America at the time, I believe it's about 1989, American Association for Ukrainian Studies is formed as a new organization to study Ukraine specifically. And again, I've been a president of this association in the past, and I try to sort of read up on the history. And it seems like, again, it was really interesting. It was a grassroots initiative with scholars, a lot of them social scientists, who really felt that kind of this older traditional studies of Ukraine that were more focusing on cultural and linguistic and so forth issues were still very important, but now there is a need for study of social processes, social political processes. And for example, sections were created within that association that was specifically social science section. And in the Ukrainian Research Institute, I mean, Serhii would know more, but I think also became more focused. Like I say, I remember as a graduate student going to lecture series that were dedicated to Ukrainian politics. They were like specifically, right, that people began to be invited. Classes were taught. I took in the early 90s at Harvard classes where political science was specifically dealing with Ukraine, like the field of post-communist politics was created in the government department. And, I was one of the few people, students at the time, graduate students who were studying Ukraine, with the support of the faculty and so forth, politics in Ukraine. So I'll maybe stop here. I'm sure Serhii has more insight, but sort of to me, this focus to, social/political aspects and dedication of institutions and formations within the existing institutions that now shifted focus to these processes was one of the important changes.
That's a very helpful connecting link back to what Serhii had said earlier about medieval history, study of religion and the humanities and language having a kind of primacy, and then social sciences, as you're describing it, Oxana, coming into their own after 1991. But let's turn now to Serhii for thoughts about Ukrainian independence and its effect on scholarship.
Yes, first of all, it legitimized what already was there and done in North America in particular, in terms of research, in terms of the publications. Both institutes that I talked about at Harvard and at the University of Alberta, they had their publication programs, and pretty much they started something that in the mind of many people didn't exist, or maybe existed in the past. And suddenly in the 1990s, work started to appear using the publications put in political sciences on the issues of identity, and when people tried to explain what happened with the fall of the Soviet Union, when all these publications started to be somehow important, people were going to them, people were citing them, and that was a big change. Suddenly, Ukrainian studies became mainstream. But as Oxana said, and as you, Michael, suggested, they were also changing the focus, or expanding into the sphere of social sciences and political sciences, because there was something to study. And I remember my colleagues at that time saying that the social scientists and political scientists were much more prepared to take Ukraine as a legitimate subject of study because it existed there. There were politics, there was society, then were historians or literary scholars, which were still very much functioning within this very much Russocentric paradigm, with a big suspicion to any attempts to split the East Slavic studies or Slavic studies into different departments. So another thing that I want to say is that the people who came into Ukrainian studies on all subjects, on all areas, were not necessarily emigres, and also they were young. And that was really, I think, a very, very important change and shift. They were looked at with some suspicion by all-timers. We were here fighting this war, trench warfare, and now these guys come and tell us what is right, what is wrong, what we were supposed to do or not. But it was extremely healthy development. I would say, to a degree, a de-ghettoization of the field that was under a lot of pressure, was trying to break out, but had these difficulties. And 1991 suddenly legitimized that entire field that was formed at the time when people thought, okay, anything that really can be done and studied about Ukraine can be studied only in North America, because the conditions in the Soviet Union are not there. They don't allow the free examination of subjects.
Yeah, maybe just to add to the maybe something Serhii was saying, especially with the younger generation. I think another difference at the time was that people came, to the study of Ukraine and North America from Ukraine, right? Because that was also an important. Obviously, during the Cold War, travel was limited. If somebody, emigrated, that was, that dissident, permanently migrating, so forth. Very few, right? But then, of course, various scholarship opportunities became available, study abroad, exchange, academic exchanges, and so forth. And then you see, this sprinkling of scholars from Ukraine who studied all sorts of things, who were coming to North America. Some of them, ended up being there more permanently. Some of them came, on visits, many of them on repeated visits. And I think that also changed the community, because then, so the community of Ukrainian studies and scholars in Ukrainian studies was no longer, just emigres or people who were born and raised here. It now included, arguably not to sufficient extent, but still included, right, people from Ukraine who were working there, researching there, and that I think also changed the nature of the field.
This, takes me to my next question. Follows, I think, from the word that you just used a moment ago, Serhii, de-ghettoization, and that's a discrete space, a kind of enclosed space, a ghetto, and to move out of that is to move into more open spaces. And so the question now is about Ukrainian studies after 1991 and the different frames that existed. So the nation state, of course, that seems an unavoidable frame for the topic, but there's also the possibility of a regional framing, which could be Ukraine in the Black Sea, or Ukraine in Europe, or Ukraine in Eastern Europe, or Ukraine in Central Europe, many different options. And then finally, a global framing. Oxana, you mentioned diaspora populations, which are substantial in the case of Ukraine, and also longstanding in the case of Canada and the United States, going back to the 19th century, and many other ways in which one could study Ukraine as a unit or an entity within a global economy, a kind of global marketplace, etc. So to start with you, Serhii, just thoughts about the nation state versus the regional framing versus the global framing. They're not mutually exclusive, of course, but they are different.
Yeah, there was, and to a degree still is really tension within the field because the scholars from Ukraine or scholars of Ukrainian background who studied Ukraine outside of Ukraine, for them, one way or another, the political framework was the issue of Ukraine not having independence. Ukraine not allowed a national narrative that was formed by people like Mikhailo Hrushevsky around 1917, before 1917, and then suppressed by the communist regime. So Ukraine never really had a chance to develop that national narrative, and the 1991 happened to a great degree because of the mobilization in Ukraine. And the Ukrainian scholarship met this broader world where the national narratives was as a minimum passé, as in worst case, that was a sign of nationalism. There was a European Union, creation of European identity, the nationalism was, and national narratives were associated with all sort of negative things. And there were two different type of societies producing different sort of questions and tasks for the scholarly world, and that certainly reflected itself in the tensions within the field of Ukrainian studies. So at the end, in Ukrainian studies, the task was to develop narrative that was never allowed to be developed in the course of the 20th century, because that's essential part also of a historical identity, national identity, cultural identity in the region, but also be in dialogue with the outside world, for whom this is a 19th century stuff that has no place really in academia or in academic studies. And one of the ways to deal with that is, of course, to talk about Ukraine in the broader context, regional or otherwise. That's what at least I personally tried to do, and I found to do that extremely very easy. Easy as a historian, given for the same reasons that Ukrainian studies were marginalized, that there was no state. You can't study Ukraine in the even in the 20th century without studying the history of Poland, which controlled part of Ukraine, without understanding the history of Romania, which controlled part of Ukraine, without understanding what Hungary is about, without getting into the issue of Moldova, without certainly knowing what the Russian Empire is and what the Soviet Union was, and where Brezhnev or Khrushchev that come from Ukraine fit in all of that story. So if you really are a serious scholar, again, I'm talking now about history, but that probably applies to literature, of pre-1991 Ukraine, this broader framework, despite the fact that, of course, there is a national narrative and it has its place and it has its legitimacy, especially for the new countries. But there is also no way just to go in with the national narrative, ignoring the history, ignoring the realities. So something that emerged as a tension, I think, has a very, very not maybe easy, but certainly very academically legitimate way of resolving of those tensions.
Oksana, I want to ask the same question of you, and I'll just throw in one other possible framing, which is the local framing, which for the social sciences is often very important. The study of a city or of a community or of a town or an institution that might be very, sort of narrowly focused in terms of space, but of course can be very significant in terms of research.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I was really, interested. A lot of things Serhii was saying about history were also resonating with me when I think of, Ukraine and the social sciences, the study of social sciences after 91, and especially this sort of danger, for lack of a better word, that I think some scholars who study Ukraine, especially kind of nation building processes in Ukraine, this suspicion of being a nationalist. I think this is very important and very kind of unfortunate because, Serhii was saying that this field of, moving kind of post-national direction, again, European Union, many countries in a way sort of at the next stage of nation building, if you think kind of historical trajectory, right, that you're now integrating, but the states have been established, right, like many of them after centuries of trying to become states and so forth. And here, comes Ukraine. And there are some, say, processes within Ukraine that, we, in political science, we put under the umbrella of nation building, that say like language policy, right? Like I see Volodymyr Kulik in the audience, who is the preeminent authority on Ukrainian language policy, right? And one of the things that the Ukrainian state did at the time is adopt Ukrainian as the only state policy. And again, the Ukrainian language is the only state language. And again, sort of depending from what angle you look at it, right? Like it could be sort of like a sign of nationalism. Like why is that as opposed to, multiple languages, like in European Union, right? But I think what this lens would miss that the alternative was not some sort of European Union, but restoration of Russian domination. And in fact, language was one of the tools that regimes in Moscow, increasingly under Putin, but that was, present, this language tension has been there earlier, kind of saw as a way to keep Ukraine and Russia kind of more enmeshed, right? Like sort of in a way to prevent the building of distinct Ukrainian identity. And I think to have these sorts of conversations, and they were happening in political science also, I recall, and I know from colleagues that sort of if expressing this view and sort of, maybe structuring your research with the realization of this was not often well received, right? So again, this, I think, kind of the fact that Ukraine was a stateless, nation, stateless people, and then the state comes in at the time when things in Europe and kind of globally are moving in many ways post-nationally, I think created also some tensions in the study, of Ukraine. But I'll go back to the other, question that you were posing about local, global, national. I think in political science, in some ways, Ukraine was actually integrated, especially in comparative politics, which is a subfield of political science that studies non-US, like foreign, countries, in a way sort of fitted nicely because once the state was there, even for people who didn't otherwise study Ukraine or know Ukraine, it was like a legitimate case study, right? Like if I'm going to study party politics, right, or like say local political dynamics, I'm going to add another case, and that case may well be Ukraine, right? So in that sense, it was not problematic to integrate Ukraine. The only problem would be that some people thought the case maybe was insignificant and or they didn't know anything about it, and say if you don't know the language, like it's harder to study, right? But as far as kind of conceptually, I think integrating Ukraine as a case in the study of various cases was possible. So we do see research, be it on local politics, be it on some sort of maybe transnational themes, say migration, right? Like international migration inherently, transnational phenomena. And, I studied migration in Ukraine in particular in the early 90s, which was, a comparative study. So I think sort of the challenge in a way for the social sciences at the time, maybe, and maybe it wouldn't be only for social sciences, is kind of the significance of Ukraine as a case in and of itself, right? It's one thing to say like, okay, this could be studied as one of your cases. And it's another thing to say, I'm going to focus on Ukraine, right? And I'm going to become an expert in Ukraine as a social scientist, as a political scientist. And I think that was still problematic, although I should say, I think in part it was about kind of underappreciation maybe of the importance of Ukraine and maybe some legacies of the Cold War in that sense. But I think in part it's also the way the discipline evolved when somebody specializing in sort of one case was maybe becoming less common and kind of this comparative work is becoming more important. And another thing I would add as far as, the evolution of social sciences, the study of Ukrainian social sciences, that I think the extent of data collection that people were able to do, in Ukraine, again, anything from surveys that before was just not possible, right? And now there is like very robust communities of scholars, many of them cross-national, like transnational, that collect various data from Ukraine, analyze it, study protests, study elections, all these sorts of things. So I think in some sense, I was going to say that maybe in integrating Ukraine in the study of social science became somewhat maybe easier than in history, because again, the way kind of the field is structured, you're just adding more cases. But some of the things, the problems that Serhii was, and the challenges that Serhii was talking about also really resonate with me as a social scientist when I think about, especially this sort of suspicion of somebody being a nationalist, right? Like you have Canadian scholars studying Canada, nobody says going to be nationalist, right? But like I think for some of us, especially Ukrainian origin, studying Ukraine, and these issues having to do with nation building, state building, nationalism, so forth, had to sometimes, face that kind of stuff.
I'll just say to our audience that you're most welcome to send in questions. Some of you already have to the Q&A function of the webinar, and we'll do our best to get to all of the audience's questions if we can. Oxana, I want to pose this question first to you, and you had mentioned 1991 as an exogenous shock to the field of Ukrainian studies, that usually academic fields are transformed by methodological changes or changes in theoretical underpinnings, but the advent of Ukrainian independence changes the field. And I want to ask about another exogenous shock to the field, which is the Maidan revolution of 2013, 2014. It seems an event of such size, stature, and scope that as a scholar, you can't, look away from it. And I'm sure people didn't want to in 2014 and thereafter. People wanted to understand it and studying it. But especially for the field of political science, it just seems, sort of exceptionally important. And I wanted to ask you about the changes or the effects that it had on the study of Ukraine.
Yeah, I would maybe mention two things in this regard. I was thinking about sort of the importance of Maidan, and kind of two things come to mind. One is about the focus on civil society, like society as opposed to state structure. And I think another is this really growing realization that Ukraine is not Russia. And I think it's very important because, this was, of course, famous phrase of Ukraine's second president that, he wrote the whole book about it. But so what does it really mean? Because when we think about the early 90s, right, Yeltsin comes to power in, Russia, and he was already obviously a big figure in the late 80s. And sort of Russia is seen as in many ways kind of more progressive, right? Like there is more economic reform there. There is, more democratic government. Yeltsin was, of course, a great Democrat, right? And in Ukraine, like the economy is, the reforms were not as extensive. And, also this old communist elite essentially stayed, right, in charge with Kravchuk changing the mantle, so to say. I mean, I'm simplifying, but that's, I think, was kind of the perception that, Russia sort of leads the way. And Ukraine is still like in the farvater, like what's the English word for that? Like, kind of behind, right? Like not maybe that fundamentally different and still in a way sort of a little bit less. And I think Maidan really changes this because here we have, right, Ukraine becomes, it's, where the political, the regime really is not able to orchestrate the elections, right? And to kind of, even Yeltsin orchestrates his re-election in 96, right? And then sort of power transitions, to Putin. And in Ukraine, there is this fundamental rupture. There is this whole state machinery, this whole apparatus trying to keep Yanukovych in power, right? They actually managed to rig elections. And then that doesn't happen, right? Like something sort of snaps there in a way that I think people are like, wow, how did this happen? Like, what is it, right? Like, if Ukraine was not that different from Russia, like, we should have expected the same outcome. And since outcome was different, we really need to understand this. And this is sort of my second point, that then there is this emphasis on the study of civil society, because, of course, Euromaidan, I mean, the Orange Revolution and Euromaidan later on, right, was really a grassroots initiative that we have, people mobilizing across the country, for many weeks on the streets, so forth, and producing the changes, right? So this notion, again, that Ukrainian society is either passive and or is not consequential and or less mobilized and, and less kind of interesting to study, therefore, than society in Russia, potentially, like all of these things kind of come crashing down. And I think then we see this, a lot of both like literature is published. And again, Ukraine is integrated in the study of the various series of social movement are developed. Scholars are actually on the ground collecting data, talking to protesters, right? So there is also this type of research that you're saying, more kind of grassroots-based ethnographic, right? Like how did people in Ivano-Frankivsk mobilized to go to the Maidan. And like I remember some scholars actually finding out that there were these local networks that, people at the workplace organized and traveled and so forth. And so all of this receives a lot of kind of social scientific attention. So people are not just observing it in a journalistic fashion, they're trying to theorize it. And that, I think, also advances the study of, say, social protest movements and things like that. So sort of these would be the two kind of main, things I would mention about the importance of 2004, kind of really striking home I think, realization that Ukraine and Russia are not just kind of, in various ways similar, that there are substantially different and in a way more positive, sort of more democratic the basics, right, or trajectory in Ukraine. And we do see that in the ultimate polling, like there would be this divergence between Russia and Ukraine and the political regime type after 2004, and the importance of Ukrainian society as an actor in its own right, and therefore the importance of studying it.
Which takes us in some ways to the present moment, which we'll get to. Serhii, I wanted to ask the same question of you, but just to note what the book that I had mentioned in the introduction. So The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine, is published by Basic Books in 2015. If I understand academic publishing, this had to have been finished on your part 2012, 2013, couldn't have been written, 3 months before it was published. And yet, the title is such a remarkable concordance with the Maidan Revolution, which has many sources and many focuses, but one of them, of course, is Ukraine's participation in European life and the sort of waving of EU flags on the Maidan. So the Gates of Europe is a metaphor, but one that feels quite real in 2014. And I'm very curious about your thoughts about the transformative effect of the Maidan Revolution, perhaps on the study of history or more generally on Ukrainian studies.
Yes, you are absolutely correct. There is an echo of Orange Revolution, at least of 2014, and then Maidan of 2013 there. And the question that was there, sort of rhetorical question, in what country and how many people are prepared to fight and potentially die under the banner of European Union? And geographically, there was just one place in Europe at that time, and that was Ukraine. The Ukrainian project from early on was very much Europe-oriented, and that became especially clear with the two Maidans, with the revolution of 2004 and then of 2013. Interesting that the goal was not joining the European Union. So no one on the political level put that forward, that idea. It was association agreement with European Union. And what that meant was that not the Ukrainians not so much put as a specific task of joining European Union as they wanted to bring Europe to Ukraine. In terms of the rule of law, in terms of the democracy, Ukraine turned out to be one of a very few places in the post-Soviet space where the 1990s flirt with democracy continued and developed into the institutions and became part of the general political culture and belief of the masses. So, I, as a historian, I wanted to look at Ukraine specifically through that prism of independence for the 1991, but also 2004 and 2013. Trying to explain today, that's what historians quite often do. Try to understand how did we get here? How did Ukraine got there? Oxana mentioned that, the biggest hope for the triumph of democracy, the end of history, were associated with Boris Yeltsin, who climbed on the tank, not with the Leonid Kravchuk, who changed the chair from the ideology boss of the Communist Party of Ukraine to the president of Ukraine. But then something changed, and that was one of the questions that I wanted to answer, looking at history of Ukraine and making it really important and understandable for us today and for Ukrainian readers as well. So that was the ambition. I don't know how really articulated it was in my mind, but now, as what historians do, we take a particular event and put it in the place chronologically where it was, and that's it looks like what was really influencing me at that time. Thank you.
I have two final questions, which I'll pose one after the other, and then we'll take the questions of our audience. And the first is a question about 2022. I mean, we've skipped over a lot of important events, annexation of Crimea and Minsk diplomacy, but that's a topic for another day at this point. I want to ask about the 2022 invasion with a question that looks to its effect on Ukrainian studies in two different ways. And one thing I've noticed, and I think this is just a fact, is that there's been a lot of investment in Ukrainian studies since 2022. Thinking of Viadrina University in Germany, which is building up a large Ukrainian studies program. I think an effort to hire in the field of Ukrainian studies across many American universities, and a greater degree of interest, which can only be to the good. On the other hand, I think that there are risks when it comes from a war, a kind of major event and a violent event, of equating a country with a war, and in some respects not seeing a country in three dimensions or seeing it fully. And so I want to ask about these two aspects of the present moment, starting with you, Serhii, and then turning to you, Oxana, about an increased number of resources and perhaps certainly increased interest in the general public, and I would assume among undergraduates and graduate students. And on the other hand, the risks of having this be war-driven. It's not a question about the Cold War. We've kind of talked about some of those consequences. This is a very different moment, and yet I think that there are still risks in sort of war-driven interest. So I'll start with you, Serhii, and then turn to you, Oksana.
Yes, I will start with a very simple statement that this is a big war, the largest war, not only in the Europe, but in the world since 1945. So the wars of that proportion, they change the international order, and certainly they impact the scholarship. And the impact of 2022 invasion and the war that continues today and entered the fifth year, I can certainly see and feel not only in Ukrainian studies, but also in the regional studies generally. So Association for the Study of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Russia, ACES, one of the themes was decolonization. So that and decolonization was focused not so much on the Ukrainian studies, but on the Russian studies and rethinking the history, the politics, the study of the politics of the region. In a way, forcing the entire field, the broader field, to adjust and adapt to the new realities, the way how the French studies or the British studies were changed by decolonization of the 1950s and the 1960s. So I see that the academic field is catching up with the rest of the studies of literature and history, maybe politics as well. I'm less competent there. That was undertaken, that our colleagues in the departments, they already think in those terms that were formed by the transformations of the 60s, and now the study of the Russian Empire, of the Soviet Union is catching up. So it's much broader than impact on Ukrainian studies. What is happening with Ukrainian studies? There is more interest, there is more investment, including in the study of Ukrainian language. It became clear that you can't be an expert on that country just knowing Russian or knowing English. The Ukraine is on the map in Europe in particular. You mentioned Viadrina. We can talk certainly about something that is happening in Poland. In United Kingdom, as far as I know, there are two professorships, designated professorships in Ukrainian studies, and that's very much academics also decided to define them in that way. This is Andrew Wilson in England, and this is Victoria Donovan in Scotland. So that's quite important and quite significant. Now, what that attention does to Ukrainian studies, that's also probably the key question that you asked. I would say that at this point, more positive than negative. So the attention is there. The attention to the war, I also welcome it if it treated in the right way. Because one thing that I noticed in my field, and again, history is trying to sit on two chairs, humanities and social sciences at the same time. And what I noticed that really we didn't pay much attention to the war and the transformational effort of the wars in the history and in the transforming societies in general. So I hope that the war will end in Ukraine as soon as possible. But I hope that the impact in terms of that we have to take seriously the wars historically, politically, in terms of social, that will stay with us, that will not disappear. And where I see really limitations is that now studying Ukraine, the country that heroically resist this attack from the former imperial master, in that way, you have some level of self-censorship. What can you talk about? What you cannot talk about? You want to be not on the right side of history. You want also to be on the right side of developments that are happening in developing today. So that's where I see the limitations. There is a level of self-censorship, but again, I think that that's something that will disappear very soon as the war is over. But I hope that the interest in Ukrainian studies will continue, and our realization of the importance of the war as not just a historical phenomenon, but as a phenomenon of today, that will continue.
I mean, I'll just add as a footnote that what I noticed with the public conversation about the war in the United States is that it might begin with Ukraine, but it very often and sometimes very quickly becomes a conversation about the United States, whether it's John Mearsheimer and the kind of NATO expansion argument, or other arguments about how well the United States has done in supporting Ukraine in the war. I mean, the content can vary, but I'm sometimes shocked by how quickly the conversation boomerangs back, maybe not unsurprisingly, but still with all kinds of limitations built in, how the conversation boomerangs back to Washington and what the United States does. But let me turn to you, Oxana, with this question about the impact and your thoughts about, I mean, perhaps you'd wish to respond to what Serhii has said about sort of the positive and the negative, and the positive outweighing the negative.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe I'll sort of have 3 points, broadly speaking. So on this, war being kind of arguably maybe over-focus in Ukrainian studies, that you were alluding to. I guess if I'm understanding what Serhii is saying, I also don't think like that by itself is a problem, because not only the war is obviously hugely important, hugely transformative, not only for Ukraine, but for European and global security. I mean, war in a way also can offer a lens to all sorts of things, right? Like the impact of the war, to all sorts of things to study about Ukraine, right? Like anything we can think of, like role of women, right? Like how has that been transformed? Processes like, say, societal, again, social organization, right? Like migrations. There are all sorts of things that you're not studying the war, right? Like, so I think if you think of war in like strictly military terms, if Ukrainian studies were limited, say, like to, sort of specific military aspects, right? Like that would be limiting. But I think, I mean, at least, again, we'll see how it goes over time. But my understanding is, as I look at the field now, that the war is not treated as sort of like the one thing to study, but more kind of as a lens to understand the transformation, of all sorts of other things, both within Ukraine and, kind of globally and regionally, and how what happens in Ukraine affects processes elsewhere in Europe, and as you may say, also the US. So I think that is in a way, I mean, again, just in my opinion, I don't think that is so much of a problem. Where I think, and another maybe positive aspect I've also mentioned, I noticed also in my own scholarship, I think this decolonization phenomena that Serhii talked about, I do want to say a little bit more about it, I think also created kind of new solidarities that were maybe not really there before. Like some new associations were formed, for example, Ruta, that was formed in response to the war, and very much kind of the force for decolonization. It brings people, scholars who otherwise may not meet each other. We're talking about Moldova, we're talking about Georgia, we're talking about, places further in the global south even, right, that come together, that study things such as, various aspects of feminism, environmentalism, and they, again, kind of building these global solidarities across across continents, right? So we're not just talking about sort of North America. Like again, I went to one of the Ruta conferences. They do this annual conventions in Western Ukraine. I recommend all the scholars in the audience and people interested in Ukraine look up this association. And the topics that they cover there and the kind of people come, this sort of very intersectional. We have art, we have environment, we have politics kind of studied, looked at together. I mean, to my mind, like that is really quite, again, if we're talking about impact on the scholarly community, I think that's an important change. But then this decolonization, I mean, it is obviously very important, but it also strikes me that there is still like a lot of work to be done there, right? And again, here, you mentioned Mearsheimer and this whole notion. This is kind of part of this broader debate. Like, what is this war really about? Is this really about Russian colonialism and imperialism? In which case, we need decolonization and kind of decentering Russia, and the Russian studies by extension. Or is this because NATO expanded, right? And this is sort of U.S. fault, and therefore, like, let's not be too mean to Russia and like Russian studies and so forth. And we do see this debate to this day. I mean, there has been a movement since, just to give one example, for the academic community, to try to rethink the naming of our centers, right? Like Center for the Study of Russia and Central Asia, like Russian Eurasian Studies, Russian East European Studies. Like, why does Russia have to be named, right? Like, we don't have centers for the study of like China and Asia or Germany and Europe, right? Like, it seems very straightforward proposition to me. But, I know like people, some of my colleagues have fought battles in their universities for years and not always successfully to try to change this. It took, in my university, it took us like 3 years to rename our undergraduate, culture name, like from Russian culture to Russian East European culture. I was teaching a course in Ukraine that was supposed to go under Russian culture label. Like what? So these sorts of things, right? And again, there is, and to me, that kind of parallels some of the things we talked about in the early 90s. This kind of academia rethinking its traditional, Russo-centeredness in many ways. I mean, and of course, things have changed greatly in 30 years, but clearly, since these things, the war can brought to the surface, that there is still more to be done. And, for what it is, academics tend to disagree with each other. And still in our field, not everybody thinks that these things are necessary or, should be prioritized. And I think that's the kind of conversation that will continue going forward.
I'm going to skip my final question, which was going to be about the future of Ukrainian studies and sort of recommendations to younger students and scholars, because I think that perhaps you can implicitly bear that in mind with the questions from the audience. I didn't want to, sort of neglect the audience's questions. And so this follows nicely on what you were just saying, Oxana. It's a question about postcolonial studies and whether there are risks in applying some of the theoretical models for postcolonial studies developed in particular to analyze the French and the British Empire, in which race and racial distinctions, racial hierarchies are central. If there's a risk in applying that to Ukraine or perhaps to the region, because instead of sort of a maritime empire where racial differences were part of the imperial project, the Russian and Soviet empires functioned differently. So I'll start with you, Oxana. I mean, you don't have to necessarily stay so specifically within the question. If you want to just speak to in general where older theoretical models of postcolonialism might need to be revised, I think that would be perfectly adequate.
Yeah, I would say that there is, first of all, vibrant research going just on that topic, right? And this is not kind of my specific area of expertise. So I would, just mention, for example, there is a new scholarly association called Ukrainian Decolonial Studies Network. Svetlana Bedarieva has organized it. And one of the things exactly scholars, do they're looking at various sort of approaches to colonialism, approaches to imperialism, right, that existed before, and then see to what extent they are not applicable or maybe need to be rethought. And I think what you're saying, that this sort of, how racism is central to colonialism, right? Like, could there be many versions of imperialism and colonialism? There is this debate about whether Russia and the Soviet Union before it, in imperial, right, was a colonial force, right? Like, or was this actually anti-colonial force? And in a way that builds into politics, because of course Soviet Union marketed itself and in the developing world in particular, because it was, against Western capitalism. By extension, if those countries were colonies, like Soviet Union was anti-colonial force, and that still resonates, in many parts of Africa and so forth. But in this, as far as the scholarly community, I think the questions that are being asked and debated is like, what makes a particular, form of rule a colonial or imperial rule? Does it have to be about race, or could it be about other things, right? Like, in that sense, like you say, like even the linguistic and various other tools of colonialism, as Russia has been using, Russian in particular, right, and in Ukraine in particular. So I think these are the kinds of conversations that are happening. So my short answer to your question would be that no, I don't think we can take these models of, study of colonialism, especially the ones that centered around race, that were developed for these maritime colonies, and kind of, import them, right? But I think then the question becomes, how do we rethink them, right? What elements of these frameworks are applicable, and which elements of these frameworks really need to be rethought in light of, the developments and the war in Ukraine. And then I think we also have to be kind of face up that there is resistance to rethinking these things, right? And there is, resistance to, for example, defining Russia as a colony or as an empire, and its policies as kind of being driven by imperialistic impulses. So I think that's exactly the kind of research and conversation and debates that are going on, and I imagine that would continue for some time.
Serhii, I want to ask the same question to you, but since you're a historian, perhaps you'd want to weave in the notion of empire as such here. Study of comparative empires is one of the great historical topics. You have Russian Empire, Soviet Empire, Habsburg Empire, Ottoman Empire, which sort of comes into play as empires that might be directly pertinent to the history of Ukraine. But then, if one does a comparative approach, British, French, other kinds of empires, what one can learn and what maybe some of the risks are of conflating different kinds of imperial history.
Sure. So let me start with the French Empire and suggest a name for a center that would mirror Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies. The center could be named French, African, and Indochina studies, because that's what it is. That's what we have with Russia. We are trying just to come up with different names to really deal with the imperial space. So we don't do that in French imperial history. What I suggested, French, West African, and Indochina, is laughable, but it's not laughable when it comes to our part of the world. The racial hierarchies and maritime empires. That's very much where the decolonization model is coming from, in terms of trying to overcome really the political realities, but also the limitations imposed on research. The trick here, in my opinion, is not to go with the Ukrainian history, or Uzbek history, or any other history, or Russian for that matter as well, to the methodology and approaches developed by the students of French or British Empire, and say, me too. We also have that, and we also fit the bill, and we also can use the term. The task is actually to have and initiate a broader discussion of what is empire, and in that sense change actually the discussion about the empire, because it is viewed very narrowly at this point. It's only maritime empire. Decolonization can be only connected to race. The revolt can be only against the West, which allows Russia, that was, after Britain, the largest territorial empire in the world, continues to be the largest country in the world, to position itself as the leader of the decolonial movement, which really means creating a common front to criticize, or common platform to criticize the West. So the task, I think, is not just to transform the history or the understanding or the research on the post-imperial space in the Russian sphere of influence, former, now more and more formal sphere of influence, but to bring this experience to a broader discussion and have change also understanding of the concepts. So that's I think the trick. That's the task, a very difficult one, much more difficult than just to ask whether we can join the club and play by the rules.
This takes us to our final question, and I'll start with you, Serhii, and then Oxana will give you the last word for today's conversation. And the question is about the kind of natural academic partners of Ukrainian studies, or the potential academic partners. And I think for historians, it's going to be a bit different than for political scientists. But the questioner asks about, sort of Polish studies of the Baltic republics, Belarus, Jewish studies, sort of different regional spheres and focuses, and where they can feed into Ukrainian studies and where Ukrainian studies can feed into them. And if you wish to offer providing your answer to this question, Serhii, if you wish to offer thoughts about where students should be focusing at the moment, if one is a late stage undergraduate or an early stage graduate student, is there anything that you would recommend, sort of bearing in mind, thinking about whether it's archival resources, whether it's topics and themes, or thinking of the last question, sort of theoretical paradigms and methods and such. If you have anything to offer in that regard, that would be wonderful. But natural partners of Ukrainian studies, and then perhaps just a few thoughts about where younger people should take this discipline.
Sure. I was the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute when the war started, the big war in 2022. And we prioritized, we have a program, fellows, and we prioritized, of course, applications from Ukraine at that time. And we turned to our colleagues and partners at Harvard, to different centers and institutions, Jewish, European, Russian, and Eurasian, asking them whether some of the applicants whose applications in Ukrainian studies, but also fit, there can be Jewish themes and topics and connections, and European and others. And they were very kind, really trying to help us with that. But the lesson overall was that we had no problem of finding and identifying the applicants in the pool of Ukrainian studies that could also very, very successfully apply and would be accepted for fellowships at the Jewish Center, sometimes at Middle Eastern, but European and Russian centers as well. So that was something that was happened not just by us thinking what the Ukrainian studies is, but just trying to act under the stress and of particular circumstances. And I think that this is not just multidisciplinarity in general, but also this thinking about what is Ukraine in the broader context of all this connections, going back to this metaphor of gates of Europe is extremely important approach to keep in mind when you think about Ukrainian studies. So what I really encourage students to do is to really try to think about Ukraine in the context of transformation of our understanding of the region in particular. Not every generation of new scholars that comes in comes at the time when there is a major, to a degree, crisis in the field, debates and testing new concepts, and we talked about decolonization. It is your chance for the younger scholars, for graduate students to come and change the field, because there are so many opportunities. There is so little dogmas there. There are so many questions that are being asked, and here it's already my personal preference. I think that looking at Ukrainian history, at Ukrainian culture, at Ukrainian politics is a very good entry point to really reconfigure the field again, not just the field of Ukrainian studies, but broader. And Ukraine is leverage where you can do that maybe more effectively than in other cases. But I'm sure that someone working on Belarusian studies will have a lot of good things to say about that particular entry point. So that would be my advice. But generally, that's a unique moment to come to the field to change it. It's ripe for change. It's open. In the next 10 years, we'll decide for the next couple of decades of what the field will look like.
Let me ask the same question to you, Oxana, by way of conclusion. I mean, regional studies might be more, or area studies might be more intuitive as partners for historians. In your case, you've mentioned comparative politics, you've mentioned the study of civil society, and sort of an intersectional approach that takes research methods from many other disciplines and brings them into Ukrainian studies. So let me just ask about that. In effect, again, kind of natural partners. And then if you have any concluding thoughts on where you think younger scholars or scholars who are sort of devising research projects at the moment, where they should take this field, that would be, I think, a very nice place to conclude.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with everything Serhii just said. And I think this sort of, using Ukraine as a study of Ukraine as kind of an entry point and in some sense a lever for big important questions, right? That affect not just Ukraine, but affect the field, or sets of theories more broadly. I think that's a unique opportunity. And sort of here, kind of, I guess, maybe a twofold suggestion. So on the one hand, I think it is indeed, especially in political science, we always push students to sort of say like, okay, what's your elevator pitch that would be of interest to a broader group of political scientists, right? Not just about who studies your specific topic, whatever it is. It does not necessarily say that, Ukraine is not important, but like whatever you're studying, right? Like what do you have to say to the scholarly community more broadly, right? From your research. And secondly, the fact kind of, so I think that advice, I think holds it because again, what we learn by studying Ukraine, be it about warfare, be it about, gender, kind of changing gender roles, right? Be it about civil society, be it about European integration. There are so many lessons, right? And you really can, leverage one's, expertise in Ukraine and interest in these kind of broader questions that will bring interest to broader group of scholars studying different countries and regions and combinations and so forth. But I think so I would say that's kind of one lesson. But the other one is also kind of being comfortable with the fact that you study Ukraine, right? Like this is actually an important case, right? So there is nothing sort of like, oh, is this, I mean, like in the 1990s, I think many of us who were interested in studying Ukraine and other non-Russian parts, in the political science, at least, we were sort of like wondering and some, like getting friendly advice, maybe like broaden your horizons, right? Like, is this, you're not going to get a job if you just, specialize in that, one country and that is not Russia, right? Like specialize just in Russia was legitimate, but to specialize in like Ukraine or, Georgia or whatever was really not. All right. Again, and I think that has changed. And I think people should be, as Serhii is saying, it is really transformative historical moment that, so much is changing, such important, tragic also, but really fundamental change. And Ukraine is like at the center of it, right? And has so much to offer. Knowledge of Ukraine is so important. So I think being kind of comfortable that, with specializing in the study of Ukraine is totally legitimate. And additionally, right, like you, have this, think about how the study of Ukraine, what it tells us about the study of society and politics more broadly, and these questions that are interested in a broader group of scholars. And then final, as far as sort of natural partners, I think exactly because these kinds of questions, be it about civil society, be it about democratization, right, or obstacles to like, corruption and so forth, like they have, they in other words, applicable to many countries. And there are now these various, international group of scholars who study these very questions, right? So in political science, I think, again, many people still do, research, more like by themselves or with a smaller course or so forth. But there are now also these emerging scholarly networks that would be, doing survey research across multiple countries, including in Ukraine, right? Like, and would have expertise, some experts will be, from the study of Ukraine, either, Ukrainian experts or Western experts who study Ukraine. And I think that would also continue to be the case, especially, for graduate students. I think that's also important to kind of be aware that there are these cross-national collaborations are going on and that you could be an important part contributing to these kinds of collaborations.
Well, Professor Shevel, Professor Plokhy, thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this conversation. I hope it will be one of many future such conversations about this remarkable field. And thanks to our audience for joining us as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.